Before there were hospitals, thermometers, or even soap as we know it, parents still had to do the same impossible thing: keep a baby alive. In the Middle Ages, that was harder than almost anything else. The world was cold, dirty, and unpredictable, yet somehow, families found ways to raise children with the little knowledge and few tools they had. They wrapped their babies in linen like tiny scrolls, fed them by candlelight, and whispered protective prayers between chores and plague outbreaks. Every lullaby, every superstition, every drop of milk carried the fragile hope of survival. Tonight, we'll explore how medieval people cared for their babies, the strange rituals, the quiet routines, and the forgotten science that helped them endure. So settle in, and let's drift back to a quieter, slower world. In the quiet dimness of a medieval home, before the rise of science and the hum of machines, life began in a flicker of firelight. The cry of a newborn, fragile yet certain, was one of the few universal sounds that echoed through every age, every class, every corner of the medieval world. It pierced through the smoke that curled from hearths. It stirred the drowsy chickens roosting in the rafters. And it summoned women, mothers, sisters, midwives who knew more about life and death than most physicians of their time ever would. To be born in the Middle Ages was to step into a world balanced delicately between faith and fear, between ancient wisdom and dangerous ignorance. There were no sterile hospitals or white-coated doctors. There were, instead, dim cottages, midwives with their bundles of herbs, and generations of inherited knowledge whispered in kitchens and over straw mattresses. The science of caring for babies existed long before it was ever written down, a kind of survival intelligence that came from observation, trial, error, and the persistence of mothers who refused to surrender their children to chance. The medieval mother's story began with endurance. Pregnancy was a precarious season of hope shattered by constant risk. Women often gave birth at home, surrounded by familiar faces and the faint smell of fire and damp wood. When the first pangs of labor arrived, messengers were sent running to summon the midwife. She came carrying not instruments, but experience. Wrapped in her satchel were sprigs of herbs, oils, and small crosses carved from wood or bone, for in this time, medicine and faith were not opposites, but partners in the same struggle for life. She would speak softly to the mother, stoke the hearth, and boil water not for sterilization, but for warmth. Curtains were drawn across the single window to keep out drafts and curious eyes. The world outside faded, replaced by the rhythm of pain, breath, and prayer. Those present would murmur invocations to the Virgin Mary, to Saint Margaret or Saint Anne, saints believed to watch over childbirth. In a world without certainty, comfort often wore the shape of faith. When the baby came, it was not welcomed by silence or ceremony, but by relief. If the infant cried, the women smiled. If it did not, the room grew tense. The midwife would rub its chest with oil, clear its mouth with a strip of linen, and whisper a short prayer. The birth was not only a moment of life, it was an act of defiance against death itself, which waited at every threshold. For in the Middle Ages, nearly 1 in every 3 infants would die before their first birthday. If the baby survived the first hour, the next concern was baptism. To modern ears, the rush to baptize may sound like superstition, but to medieval families, it was urgency born of fear. A soul that died unbaptized was thought to linger in limbo, deprived of heaven. And so, if the priest could not be summoned quickly, the midwife herself would pour water over the newborn's head and speak the sacred words. This, too, was her duty, midwife, healer, and guardian of souls. Once the danger of delivery passed, attention turned to care. The new mother, pale and exhausted, lay surrounded by the signs of both birth and survival: bloodied cloths, hot water, fresh straw, and the small red face of her child. In many homes, the father would have waited outside, pacing, praying, or pretending to work. Men rarely witnessed childbirth. It was considered women's knowledge, a mystery too sacred and frightening for male eyes. In the hours after birth, the midwife would prepare the baby's first wrapping. This was the ritual of swaddling, a practice nearly universal across medieval Europe. Long strips of linen were wrapped tightly around the baby's body, binding its arms and legs close together. The result resembled a small cocoon or scroll. To modern sensibilities, it might look restrictive, but to medieval minds, it was a symbol of protection and order. Loose limbs were thought to grow crooked. Tight wrapping encouraged proper form. It also made it easier for a busy mother to manage her child while tending to her work. Swaddled infants could be laid safely in wooden cradles by the fire or carried in slings while mothers worked in the fields. Some cradles were beautifully carved. Others were simple boards balanced on rockers. The rhythmic motion of a cradle was thought to soothe the spirit and guard against nightmares, a belief that blended superstition and maternal instinct. In noble households, embroidered blankets and small bells adorned the cradle, while in peasant cottages, a handful of herbs or a carved charm hung from the side to ward off the evil eye. Feeding was another world of practical knowledge. Breastfeeding was expected. It was considered both a natural duty and a sacred gift. Mothers who could not nurse, due to illness, weakness, or social custom, hired wet nurses. Among the wealthy, this practice was common and even fashionable, allowing noble women to resume their social roles quickly. Among the poor, wet nursing was a communal act. A neighbor's milk might sustain another woman's child. There were few alternatives. Cow's milk was difficult for infants to digest and was sometimes mixed with breadcrumbs or honey to make a crude gruel. Such mixtures could spoil quickly, making them dangerous in summer months. The relationship between mother and wet nurse was intimate, complex, and deeply moralized. Religious writers of the Middle Ages often warned that the nurse's behavior could shape the baby's character, that her temperament, diet, and even her faith might influence the soul of the child through her milk. It was both biology and theology in one. For hygiene, medieval parents relied on what they knew: warmth, clean cloths, and constant attention. Baths were rare but not absent. Babies were washed in small wooden tubs with water warmed by the hearth. Soap, when available, was made from animal fat and ashes. More often, mothers used herbs like chamomile or rosemary, believed to calm the skin and spirit. After washing, the baby was dried by the fire and rubbed with oil or tallow to protect the skin from cold and dampness. The medieval home was not sterile by modern standards, but it was carefully maintained. Floors were swept with brooms made of twigs. Rushes or straw were replaced regularly, often mixed with herbs like lavender or thyme to mask odors and discourage insects. Cradles were positioned near warmth but away from smoke. Even without understanding germs, people observed the consequences of dirt and decay, and they acted accordingly. Their science was empirical, learned through experience, not written in books. Illness, however, was never far. Fevers, coughs, and infections struck infants quickly, and treatment was a blend of herbal medicine and prayer. A poultice of sage or plantain might be laid on the chest for breathing trouble. Honey was used to soothe throats and cleanse wounds. Garlic, vinegar, and onion appear often in medieval remedy books, ingredients we now recognize as having antibacterial properties. Some treatments were harmless, others less so. Mercury and lead found their way into ointments, as did powdered toad or burnt feathers. Not because of cruelty, but out of desperation. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was filtered through the theory of humors, the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A sick baby was thought to suffer from imbalance, not infection. Remedies sought to restore harmony rather than target causes. Yet even within these limitations, some treatments worked remarkably well. Herbalism was an art of observation, and mothers became skilled naturalists out of necessity. Beyond medicine, care was deeply emotional. Babies were rarely left alone. They slept near their mothers, often sharing the same bed or sleeping space. To protect them from cold drafts, mothers swaddled tightly and covered them with layers of linen or wool. To prevent suffocation, some families built wooden guards or cradles that kept the infant close but safe. Fires burned low through the night, filling the air with a mix of smoke and warmth, the scent of medieval security. Play, too, had its place in early life. Simple toys made from wood, clay, or cloth have been found in excavations. Small animals, carved whistles, rattles filled with pebbles. These were not mere decorations. They were comfort objects, distractions, and early teaching tools. A child's world was tactile, shaped by texture, sound, and repetition. Parents sang lullabies, hummed hymns, and told soft stories that blended scripture with folklore. These moments were not recorded in chronicles, but they filled most of human life. For noble families, child rearing was both personal and political. A son's survival could secure inheritance, while a daughter's health could determine marriage alliances. Wet nurses, attendants, and tutors surrounded noble infants from the moment of birth. Chronicles sometimes list their names beside those of kings, proof of how much depended on their care. Nobles commissioned wooden cradles painted with saints, hung amulets of silver or coral to protect against spirits, and recorded each child's baptism in church registers. Beneath all the ornament, though, lay the same fears as any peasant mother's: a fever that would not break, a cough that lingered too long, a silence where a cry should be. Infant mortality haunted every home, rich or poor. Some parents responded with emotional restraint, convincing themselves not to grow too attached until a child survived its first few years. Others lavished affection precisely because time was uncertain. Church records show tiny graves marked with careful inscriptions, sometimes no more than a carved cross and initials. Parents mourned deeply, even when death was expected. They lit candles for lost children and prayed for their souls, believing that heaven would restore what earth had taken. Still, many survived, enough to pass on the practical lessons of care. From one generation to the next, mothers taught daughters how to swaddle, when to wean, what herbs to use for colic or rash, how to tell a harmless fever from a deadly one. This oral tradition was the true medical school of medieval Europe, maintained by women who could not read, but who understood life through touch, smell, and instinct. Their knowledge was domestic, quiet, and often dismissed by the learned men of their age. Yet it was they, not the university physicians, who kept infants alive by the late Middle Ages. Written guides began to appear. Some were translations of ancient Greek and Arabic texts. Others were compilations by Christian scholars who merged theology with medicine. They discussed childbirth, nursing, and infant health with surprising detail. They advised mothers to maintain calm tempers, avoid corrupt air, and nurse regularly. Some even warned against over-swaddling or feeding too early, hints that observation was gradually shaping written science. Religion continued to guide daily care. The church calendar influenced everything. When women rested after childbirth, when babies were named, when they could be brought to Mass, infants born during Lent were sometimes considered blessed. Those born on certain saints' days were thought to inherit virtues. Yet, even within this framework, personal tenderness thrived. Parents celebrated first smiles, first steps, and the first time a baby slept through the night, the same milestones cherished today. Outside the home, communities supported young families in subtle ways. Neighbors shared milk, midwives visited after births, and godparents provided both spiritual and practical help. Charity toward new mothers was a moral duty. Some towns even kept foundling wheels, wooden drums set in monastery walls where unwanted babies could be left anonymously and safely, to be cared for by nuns. These institutions, however imperfect, were born of a collective understanding that even in poverty, infants deserved protection. To imagine medieval baby care only through the lens of hardship would be a mistake. Yes, survival was uncertain, but daily life also contained quiet joys. The soft weight of a sleeping child, the laughter of siblings, the hum of a lullaby. These things transcended time. Paintings from the later Middle Ages show Madonna and Child not as distant holy figures, but as tender portraits of motherhood. A woman cradling her baby, eyes heavy with love and fatigue. Artists, often unknowingly, captured the universal language of care, and beneath this love lay a system, not of laboratories or charts, but of intuition, pattern, and trust. The forgotten science of medieval baby care was empirical in its own way. It observed cause and effect long before the words clinical trial existed. Keep the baby warm, and fevers lessen. Nurse often, and crying stops. Hold close, and breathing steadies. We might call it primitive. Yet it mirrors what modern pediatrics rediscovered centuries later, that warmth. Feeding and human contact are the foundations of infant survival. What they lacked in knowledge, they replaced with presence. The medieval mother did not measure nutrients or track sleep cycles. She watched, listened, and adapted. Her science was not written on paper, but lived in every moment of endurance. If we could stand in one of those cottages now, smell the smoke, hear the gentle creak of a cradle, we would find a scene both alien and familiar. A baby's small hand clutching at cloth, a mother murmuring softly, the midwife's steady hands guiding new life into the world. The room is dim, the air thick with warmth and candlelight, but in that small space, the entire story of humanity repeats itself. The forgotten science of medieval baby care was not truly forgotten. It lingers quietly in the instincts of parents today, in the way we rock our children to sleep, swaddle them against cold, and whisper comfort into the dark. What was once ritual and superstition has become rhythm and intuition. The knowledge survived not through books, but through touch, through a mother's hand on a baby's chest, through centuries of ordinary care that carried humanity through its most fragile hours. And perhaps that is the truest science of all, the kind that begins not in theory, but in tenderness. The kind that, in the flickering light of a medieval hearth, kept 1,000 cradles rocking gently through the night, and ensured that, somehow, we would all wake to see the morning. And that brings us to the end of tonight's quiet journey through history. If you made it this far, I hope your mind feels a little slower, and maybe your eyelids a little heavier. Here on Quiet Boring Sleep, we wander through the forgotten corners of the past, not for excitement, but for calm, for the gentle kind of history that helps you drift off, knowing people have always found ways to endure, to care, and to rest. If you'd like more quiet stories like this, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and maybe even share it with someone who needs a peaceful night. Thank you for being here. Sleep well, dream softly, and I'll see you in the next quiet story.